Thank you for listening to this Forum podcast. Please check out our website for a rich archive of podcasts and writing from contemporary philosophers and other researchers on a wide variety of topics. The Forum is an educational charity dedicated to bringing academic philosophy to a broader audience. Please consider donating to us via our Just Giving page, which you can find on our website. Happy listening.
Originally envisaged this event, I thought we'd do it during the World Cup. We'd have a massive screen behind us with a live game muted, obviously, and that you would all come with your various kits. And I'm sort of looking across, and you're all looking rather sober, unless you're going to peel off your shirts and reveal an array of Real Madrid shirts to torment poor Simon, who's a Liverpool fan.
Real Madrid,
but if you do that, I'll let you ask the first question. But let me introduce the event and our speakers. So this is an event about football and philosophy. I hope that's what you're expecting. Some people think that football is a matter of life and death, began the legendary Liverpool manager Bill Shankly. I'm very disappointed with that attitude. I can assure you it's much more important than that, he said. So let's find out if that's true. In this event, we ask if the beautiful game is also a philosophical one. We'll be tackling the ethics of competition and the aesthetics of sport. What makes for a good game, and can philosophical principles be put into practice in play? I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to encourage our panellists to speak to each other, and we'll hand over to you as soon as possible, so there'll be lots of time for you to ask questions too. Now, our speakers are Dr. Gerald Moore. Gerald is in the middle there. Maybe they hate me because I'm too good, said Cristiano Ronaldo, but it could just as well have been said of Gerald Moore. He's Associate Professor in the School of Languages and Culture at Durham University. Please don't call me arrogant, but I think I'm the special one, said Jose Mourinho, but maybe he was talking about Dr. Emily Ryall. She's a reader in the philosophy of sport at the University of Gloucestershire, and Professor Simon Critchley. I wouldn't say he was the best philosopher in the business, but I would say he was in the top one, to paraphrase Brian Clough. Simon is Handian as Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research at New York. Now, Simon, you're going to start us off, and my first question is, in your book, what we think about when we think of football. This is an extended promotion for your book. You say in that book, if we are to study football philosophically, it's not so much that we should formulate axioms from football, but that we could develop a poetics of football. What do you mean by that?
So it's not, the idea that, philosophy's up here and football's down there, and that we can abstract certain principles from football and on the basis of those ideas analyse different phenomena. That's not what interests me. What interests me is the game. The game, play, and what goes on when we play and when we watch play, and trying to get as close to that experience of play as possible, to the grain and texture of that experience. And so in the book, it's very nice to be back at the Forum. I was here at the beginning a long time ago with Critchley and Montefiore, and it's fantastic it still exists. I'm very pleased. Anyway, so I digress. William James. William James is a kind of vastly underread thinker in a country like this, apart from by people like Wittgenstein. And James's approach, just how you get close to experience, right? Getting close to the experience of anything, and the experience of the game is what interests me. And then to try and tease out descriptively certain patterns. So poetics, in the way in which our friend Aristotle talks about poetics. And the good thing about, say, Aristotle's idea of poetics is that poetics is, he has certain formal ideas about tragedy, epic, and less so on comedy, but they're based on numerous specimens, numerous examples. Aristotle was a kind of a naturalist, right? And so it's important to approach football in that spirit and not to look at it from some lofty, philosophical, detached point of view, but try and immerse yourself in this this phenomenon, and to try and bring out both the stupidity of football, which I think is important, to give yourself over to something which is evidently stupid, but which I spend an awful lot of my time.
Is that just supporting Liverpool, or do you mean?
Well, that's pain. That's pain. Yeah. I just got back from Madrid this morning. I spent the last 3 days in Madrid. But the gods conspired. So I was back to see the game with my son here, and then went to Madrid, and to suffer these Real Madrid fans for days. It was horrible. Because you're getting beat. Yeah, anyway, we could talk about that. But that, anyway, so that, and what else am I going to say? And to try and attend to the detail of the game. Oh, stupidity, yeah. And the intelligence of the game. That, in a sense, for me, everything that I want to be true philosophically is true of football. And probably only true of football. And the extraordinary thing about football is that you can have these deeply held passions and connections to teams, in my case, Liverpool Football Club, and there is an extraordinary use of reasoning and rationality, which people who don't understand football have got little sense of. So what you find when you're talking to other fans or people interested in the game is an extraordinary back and forth where people are persuaded. You can change your mind. What never happens in philosophy, like I've never been to a philosophy talk ever where at the end of the philosophy talk someone says, that was really good, I've completely changed my mind. But what you said, and I'll now think, I agree with you. It never happens. People always stick to their convictions. There's something about football, and I think football it's a sport, but a funny kind of sport, maybe not even a sport in a way, which allows for this stupidity of passion and belief and conviction, and a kind of operation of intelligence, which is open to all sorts of elements of persuasion, and it's also something which is there's a tremendous equality in football. The people here have got opinions, I've got opinions, our opinions have the same merit. You can have a good football conversation with an 8-year-old kid, or with an 80-year-old person. There's something very egalitarian about football discussion, which I like a lot. There
is something irrational too about football too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting to position it as a space of the kind of exemplification of a certain kind of reason, and a reason that you don't see happening in philosophical discourse, but happening in a football match. But it's also the space of kind of fate and destiny, or ideas of superstition, right?
Yeah.
Who's the footballer who kisses somebody's head, the goalie's head before?
It was Fabien Barthez.
Laurent Blanc.
Yeah. So it's a space also of absolute irrationality too, no?
Mm-hmm. And both things at the same time. And irrationality and also superstition. It's a very superstitious game. We've all got our rituals connected with the game. With me, it's I have certain rituals around watching a Liverpool game, and I believe that me watching the game is important to the outcome of the game. The Real Madrid Liverpool game the other week, from the moment that Sergio Ramos physically assaulted Mohamed Salah, and he should be in life imprisonment or jail in Catalonia, preferably, and you knew fate was in the air. You knew what was going to happen, and there's that awful feeling of you just know what's going to happen, and it's like watching the English national team. That's a peculiarly painful experience of fate. But it's fate, and then you get this. What's even worse, you can feel it happening in these days, right now, the delusion of hope, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so even now we know. I've watched World Cup since 1966. And England won the World Cup in 1966, which is a long time ago. And since then it's been a record of disaster and despair. But still, and you know it's going to end badly, but still there's this hope that tickles and flickers. So the worst thing about football isn't the disappointment, losing, that's important. There's this hope that tickles your feet.
Do Do you have any sense of why? When I pitched this, I had nothing reasonable, just an intuition that football was the sport that philosophers most revered. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's tennis. Maybe it's wrestling. But it seems to me that a preternatural number of philosophers have had interest in football. Am I right in saying that?
I don't know. We could talk. I mean, AJ Ayer, Freddie Ayer was a Spurs fan, and Austin made little jokes about Ayers, you know. But I think no, because for class reasons actually.
Right.
I went to a grammar school in 1971. I wasn't a bad footballer, but back in those benighted days, you weren't allowed to play football at grammar school because it wasn't a gentleman's game. You played rugby and cricket. So the class dimension to that, I think it's also. I think there's some philosophers interested in football, but there's a lot that aren't. And there's a lot of people that are very ignorant of the game.
Yeah, well, no fate, read your book, obviously. One last question for you. So you were talking earlier about a kind of Aristotelian sense of the game as a kind of specimen.
Yeah.
What's exceptional about football? What makes it the exceptional specimen, do you think?
Its collective nature, I think. Its collaborative qualities. It's unlike golf or tennis for that reason. It's not an individualistic sport. If you have good individuals, that's very good, but it's a team sport. And it's the fans, right? And the fans as the kind of living archive of the memory of teams. And I see football as a kind of polytheism, right? In the sense in which these fans who will follow the rituals, know the history, players come and go, managers come and go, but the fans are often there. They've got generations and generations of history, and that culture is linked in this country and elsewhere to specific social organisations, clubs, pubs, whatever, and that's true of other sports, but in football it's true in a really deep way. And the thing is, so one claim I make, it's an absurd claim, picking up on Shankly, is that the form of football for me is socialism, right? I use Clough and Shankly as examples of that, and there are others, Paul Breitner and Socrates, the Brazilian Socrates, the chain-smoking doctor who died recently. Not long ago, but the content of football is money. It's money, and we know that. And so one question you often get is whether football is being destroyed by money. Football has always had this complex relationship to money. You need money to buy players, you know, and that money comes from certain resources. You've got a Juve fan. Juventus are a consequence of the Agnelli family, industrialization in Turin, and that whole history. And so it's dirty, and the money is much dirtier now, more questionable. But still, if you look at a team, say like Manchester City is a good example, where all that money's come in, it's bought those players, it's brought Guardiola in, and it's produced this extraordinary thing, which is Manchester City's football team. And there's ugly money there, but it's still possible as a fan to not reconcile. I don't think you can feel good about football. This is very important. I don't think football is the beautiful sport we go, oh, it's great. Football is it's beautiful, and it's an ugly game because of the operations of money and all the rest. It's kind of always been like that, and it's getting worse. And the fact that the governing organisation of the game, FIFA, is a completely corrupt body that needs to be root and branch replaced, right? Taken out of Switzerland for a start, still there's all of that corruption, yet still something can happen in a game which will surprise, delight, and engage us. But football fans are not stupid; they're not unaware of the money and the corruption and all the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. They know about that, and still they love the game. So let's think about the combination of delight and disgust, I think, is what defines the experience of being a football fan.
I've got questions for Gerald and Andy, but I wanted to give you both an opportunity to pick up on anything that Simon had just said. Does that resonate for you?
Well, I was going to actually ask Simon, so you work in a North American university.
I do.
Is there anything that you said that one of your American colleagues wouldn't say about American football or baseball or an American sport? Is there something particular to football itself?
The collaborative quality, right, which isn't true, say, of baseball. But
the passion is obviously shared. The fans, they would say there's something, so rich about those sports.
There are similarities, obviously, and in baseball there are deep cultural factors like the fact, Boston Red Sox and teams like that, or the New York Mets, who are still a new team, early '60s. So there are similarities, but there are differences. The differences in the if you like, the cultural depth and the fact that the way people talk in North American sports about the franchise, right? And the fact that the Brooklyn Dodgers in Emmett Field in Brooklyn became the LA Dodgers. I mean, that happened in the case of, who was it, Wimbledon?
Wimbledon,
It was a kind of disaster. So you imagine that Manchester United become whatever, Durham, or whatever, Gloucester. But so there's something about that which I think is different. And I think other things, aesthetic things like songs. If you've been to a baseball game or American football game, the singing is useless. Whereas for me, what a lot of football is about the complexity of the songs. In fact, the songs are long, they're specific, they change game by game, and you need to learn them, and there's a beauty to that, I think. There's a complexity to that. So it's similar, sure, to other team sports, but better. Better, yeah.
Gerald?
I'm just thinking, I don't think there needs to be anything really different. I don't think we need to go as far as saying that football necessarily does anything that cricket or hockey don't do, in the same way that one wouldn't feel compelled to say that John Updike is better or worse than any other Anglophone novel. They are different ways of grammatising the same kind of relationship, and I'll elaborate what I mean by that in due course. And I guess that what matters here is the singularity of the experience that comes out of it, not necessarily the distinctiveness of the thing in relation to which we have that experience.
Yeah, nicely put, I think. Let's move to you, because I want to know now about precisely what you were sort of insinuating there. People talk about football as a universal language, don't they? You see that during Comic Relief when David Beckham goes out to a third world country and he gets the football out, and all of a sudden they're all playing. Mm-hmm. So we have this idea that it's a universal language, and that can be sometimes quite almost sentimental notion.
Mm-hmm.
And often in teams, of course, players don't have a language in common other than football, and that, as Simon was stressing, has often to do with money in our major teams. But that's what I want to ask you about, Gerald. Has football become a spectacle of capitalism as opposed to the socialist history that Simon was gesturing towards in the 70s?
So I'll pick up first on the language point, and I'd start by saying I'm not a linguistic exceptionalist. I don't think that language is the thing that defines us as human. I think that what defines us as human is a relationship with technology, technical objects, the tool. It is through using tools to build both the world that we also build ourselves. This expression that world building is also self-engineering, and I think that this is more primordial than language, and this is really what football, we can see it as being about. The footballer is the archetypal example of somebody who invents themselves a world, a future, an experience of desire in relation to that technical object that is the football. And we can see so much else that becomes distinctive about human life, if we want to put it in those terms, that comes from this relationship with the object. Desire is not a biological thing. Desire is, I'm quoting the philosopher Bernard Stiegler when I say this, desire is purely artificial. It's not born of biological drives. It comes from creating ourselves a future and then projecting ourselves into it. And this is something that we see happen all the time with footballers. One wakes up, Lionel Messi is someone who is a football addict in absolutely the correct neurological sense of the word. That old distinction has broken down now. Messi wakes up in the morning, thinks about nothing but football, can't even think of paying his taxes, he's so focused on football. And he creates himself a future, he creates desire, projects, and this happens to little boys and girls all over the world. You dream of scoring the winning goal at Wembley or at the Dele Alpi or wherever it would be. And so this for me is more primordial than a linguistic relationship. It is fundamentally a relationship to the technical object in the world, the self that we create through that relationship. And what becomes really interesting about this is that, like all good art, the footballer as artist recreates the grammar of football, recreates a new language of expression. I think a brilliant example of this, which really saddens me that people in the UK have not seen it properly, you take somebody like Paul Pogba. I have never seen a footballer move their body around the ball and get the ball to do more work than they do themselves than Paul Pogba does. It's astonishing. And if you want to draw a series of crimes against art, where at one end of the scale you'd have Palmyra's destruction by ISIS, somewhere there will be Ai Weiwei being held captive by the Chinese government, the Philistine, vulgarian Jose Mourinho's treatment of Paul Pogba would be absolutely at the bottom end of the scale, admittedly. But this restriction of the way that Deleuze would call it a style, the ability to reinvent the language of expression becomes so much about what football's about and the creation of the desire that goes with that. Now, I think where we've shifted to more recently in terms of capitalism and the commercialisation of football. So if we go back to this basic idea that it's a relationship to the tool, well, we've moved away from some kind of balance between producing and consuming. What we're really in now is a consumerist world where we have consumption without production, where people sit and watch the spectacle of football without playing it, without participating in it. And I guess where this becomes an issue for me is that we tend to think of something like desire as an infinite resource. It's not. It wanes, it depletes, and when it gets depleted, what do we get? Depression, immiseration. And what we're seeing now, I think, is really a real disenchantment with football. I'm trying to write a little book at the moment on the idea that capitalism is and always has been, but is increasingly more so, the history of the manufacture of addictions. It works right back to the dawn of the spice routes and through smoking and alcohol, etc. But I really think you can make the claim nowadays that contemporary capitalism is about dopamining. It is about the exploitation of manufactured addictions. And what you see with contemporary football is that we consume beyond the point of pleasure. We consume out of compulsion. You see it at the level of footballers, people like David Bentley who are retiring because they're just so sick and miserable at the game. You see it with so many people who don't really care about it anymore, and this is not a healthy...
But what do you mean? That they play too much football, or we watch too much football?
I think we are constantly bombarded with it, and assumed that we have this infinite capacity to consume it, and we don't. And partly this manifests itself in the absurd, inflated commentary that you get on Sky and BT, where every game has to be incredible and an adrenaline rush, and you know that most people are just sitting there depressed and miserable, wishing they had something better to do with their lives. I think the footballers too, a lot of them will talk about the love of the game is gone. This has become drudge work, exploitation. The assumption is, well, they're being paid loads of money, so it's fine. But it's not fine. If you lose that sense of participating in something to the point where you can create some relationship of desire into which you want to project yourself, then things really start to take a pretty nasty turn. And what we have here, and I think it becomes a model of contemporary economics as a whole, is just this continual exploitation of what's left of desire to the point of exhaustion. And what follows from that is very joyless consumption, and I think that's basically where we are with football at the moment.
Great, that's a positive note. It's really fascinating, this idea of a kind of economics and the exploitation, this idea of an exploitative football. But to my mind, that only works if we're thinking about professional football, right? That we're saturated and that there's too much of it, and the players are overworked with that. But in a different context, if we think about amateur football, if we think about the kids who are kicking a football round in their garden tonight, or out every night or every weekend. My brothers were like this constantly. I was like this. There is, in that circumstance, quantity has a different effect, right? The football is the democratic game. All you need is a ball. You don't need a tennis racket. You don't need a golf club. It's a democratic game.
But we're not seeing much of that anymore, and it manifests itself in all kinds of funny little figures. We imagine that places like China and South Korea are the absolute future of the global game. Well, 98% of young men in South Korea and China have got short eyesight. Why? The basic reason for that is because they don't spend enough time outside. You need to spend about 3 hours a day outside in order to get the depth of vision that is required to have normal functioning eyesight. And the people who are part of the growth of the game aren't playing it. They're sitting there consuming it passively on screens and through FIFA. I'm not wholly against things like watching the game, playing it on computers. You know, I'm quite fascinated by the way that when I was young, I grew up in the 80s, very much long ball bashed around. I quit playing at the age of 6 because I got put in with the group of 2 and 3 year olds because I was so much smaller than everybody else. Didn't watch it again until the 1990 World Cup. And yet nowadays you see that we have a generation of the very few people who do play. They both play with the ball and play something like FIFA on the PlayStation. They play so much more intelligently than we ever did when we were at school, because they have a very distinct way of looking through the computer game, thinking about the through balls and the possibilities of technical play that gets opened up by that. So we still get new and interesting possibilities of reinvention coming out of that. But really, you know, you mentioned the amateur side of the game. The amateur side of the game is on its knees. You know, you get occasional little initiatives like Ebbsfleet Town, which I think is now falling into the dirt. That was a big fan-led project for reconstruction. We endlessly tout the virtues of the Bundesliga with its 51% fan ownership rule. But these are all the exceptions that prove the rule that the amateur game is on its knees.
That sounds like a real cri de coeur. We'll find out from the audience if they agree. One last question from me. I'm really intrigued by this idea of this kind of formulation of the game as the football as a prosthetic, or a kind of the technological analysis of the game. Mm-hmm. But it seems in your the scenario where Mourinho is torturing and exploiting poor Pogba, there's also in the game other subjects like a manager are also part of the technology too. One of the things that must happen in any game is that you learn to deal with the autonomy of other subjects. An oppressive Mourinho who says this is not how you can play, and you have to, and that's life too, right? That's a life lesson. The technology of other people.
Well, yes and no. There are.
I don't want to make you defend Mourinho if you don't want to.
Well, I mean, there are multiple ways of playing the game, and there are multiple grammars that get invented from this. There are some teams that will play very dialectically, where the individual gets sublated within the team. But for every Burnley that you've got that is a working example of that, you've got a dozen Real Madrids where dialectically they're hopeless. They are totally reliant on various individuals to keep them going. So it's, yes, to some extent one can understand the Mourinho approach that says, well, we'll bash all these parts to fit what I want. But there is also, one has to know what one is working with and what to do with it. And if you have somebody who is so fundamentally philistinic and uncreative that they can't see the tools in front of them and work out how to meld them into a semi-beautiful thing, then we're really not seeing the game at its finest there.
Great. Simon and Emily, is there anything you wanted to pick up on there?
I think, I don't like Mourinho, but but he can be defended. There's a kind of, I remember reading a paper, there's two Irish scholars that I've read a few things by, work on football, and they accused me of romanticism, right, around Klopp and Liverpool, and what they saw in Mourinho was a kind of cold Adornian modernism, right? And I think there's something to that. There's something to, there's football, Guardiola, and then there's the Klopp version. Then you've got the Mourinho version of anti-football. And it doesn't matter who cares. If Pogba fits into that structure or he doesn't. Alexis Sanchez, same thing. So there's a kind of there's a coldness to Mourinho which is kind of interesting. And so I wouldn't defend it, but he could be defended.
I liked him, in fairness to him, I liked him until relatively recently. It's the Pogba thing that's really turned me.
He was different in Porto, different in the early years at Chelsea.
I think where this becomes quite interesting is because we start to get into debates about players' rights and the assumption that just because they're paid billions that one can do anything with them, and they don't have the right to resign and walk away and go somewhere else in the way that the rest of us would if they didn't like the way that their manager behaves. And I think we also start to get onto some really interesting questions about politics in relation to football too, because we have the socialist kind of utopian models of football, which we'd link to the Guardiolas and the Klopps and the Shankleys, but then we also have deeply not just conservative but far-right traditions. And Fabio Capello is openly Lega Nord in Italy. He is an open political extremist. And I think Mourinho...
the West Ham player, the guy who went back to Lazio, what was his name?
Oh, Paolo Di Canio.
Paolo Di Canio. Yeah. Why did you give a fascist salute? Because I'm a fascist.
Yeah. and it's very hard not to see someone like Mourinho on those lines of things. And so I think we do start to move into political questions. The assumption that one can just bully the worker into doing one's bidding. And this comes into questions as well about the ethics of transgression. I guess we'll come to them in due course, so I won't preempt them.
Well, let me ask you the question I've got for you, because I do want us to talk about, I don't know if anybody's noticed, but I've tried to dress as a referee today. And I do want to talk about the place of the referee.
They don't wear black anymore, they wear yellow and...
Well, we're going to get to the referee and the referee's dress code in a moment, but what I want to ask you, Emily, is a simple question, but I think it's a really complicated answer, so that's why I'm saying this question for you. Is the beautiful game still beautiful, or has it become a brutal game?
I think it is probably more beautiful now than it ever has been in the past. Now, a lot of that's to do with technology, the lighter balls, the professionalisation of it, and the changes in the rules, whereby there's so much concern over player welfare that you can't kind of the old hard men of football, Chopper Harris, that you just kind of went in as hard as you could. There's been a real attempt to try and stamp that kind of thing out. So I would say that actually the ideal of football has the potential of being more beautiful now than it ever has been. Yeah. So it can be a brutal game, but I think for different reasons than it was previously.
And Gerald has touched on these kind of mole-ish school children in their bedrooms playing FIFA, playing esports, but you're someone who's researched esports and you take that quite seriously, right, as well?
Well, I mean, I'm astounded, I don't know with you, I'm astounded at the amount of people that will watch virtual football games, which is actually, there's some evidence that suggests that it's growing in number, and it's and certainly for a particular age group, it's more people for the younger age group will watch virtual football games and big competitions and tournaments than will watch kind of the real thing.
What do we mean by virtual football games?
Well, on the PlayStation or Xbox. So I think in the last week there's been a couple of the eSports World Cup whereby teams have, they've played it on the PlayStation and the Xbox, played against each other for the championship. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of people have been watching this. And I find it quite absurd, but there's obviously a huge demand for it, and I've been thinking about it, and I'm wondering whether actually there's more potential for beauty and to a certain extent creativity in esports than there is in the real game. Now, one of those reasons could be for the fact that because the person with the controller's got a very, very different perspective, so they can see the whole pitch rather than just that, you're just not one person on a pitch trying to control your body in a particular way. So they've got a bird's eye view of what's happening on the pitch, so they can see where the players are going. Obviously, there's a lot of artificial intelligence in terms of the computing power moving players around, but they can start to see the potentialities about where players are, how to pass the ball, which player to pass to, what kind of pass, which I guess gives it more control in that sense. There's also much less scope for, I think, cheating and gamesmanship. Yeah. Because you can't pretend to foul somebody, or you can't pretend to be fouled if you're playing it virtually. Mm-hmm. So you don't get this kind of gamesmanship. And one of the things that really does bug me about kind of football is the gamesmanship, that happens within it. So I'm wondering whether that might be a reason for the attractiveness of esports, and particularly kind of like FIFA on the PlayStation or Xbox, because of the different perspective that players get and the different potentialities in terms of what they're able to do, but also the fact that it's much more fluid and flowing. And one of the reasons that FIFA are often very conservative in their use of technology is because they say, well, we don't want it to affect the flow of the game. One of the attractive things about football is the idea that it does have this tempo, this flow to it. Mm-hmm. And the ideal of it is that, in theory, a game could go for 2 45-minute stints without there being any stoppage or breakage of play. And that may be one of the reasons why football is better than kind of the US American football. Is because
it's harder to commercialise in the US.
Yeah, because you've got this flow. Yeah. And perhaps esports allow for that flow that the real game, with its commercialism and gamesmanship, all of the rest of it, don't. I've kind of it's broken down, I think, to a certain extent.
I can see how eliminating fouling and that awful gamesmanship might be very satisfying, but it also seems to be a really purist vision of football, and we've already started talking about the history of football and its violence and its politics. We haven't started to talk about empire a great deal. We could talk about the colonial history of football too. And so maybe is there a kind of ethical problem in that vision of esports as far as it strips it of that real history?
Yeah, I think it is a very kind of anemic version. Now, personally, I would say I'm a purist rather than a partisan. I don't support any particular football team. I wouldn't even say I'm that patriotic when it comes to England playing. I personally enjoy the beauty of football for its aesthetic reasons. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that I don't appreciate what it is to be a partisan, because you get something very, very different out of the game. The fact that you feel you've got an interest and a stake in it, and it does really, really, really matter who wins. But for me, that's not kind of why I'm interested in football. I've got much more kind of purist tendencies in that regard. So I think, yes, there is some real history, culture, ritual, all the rest of it that Simon was talking about that is really important to do with football. And I think that, my idea that perhaps esports might take off because of the purist aesthetic elements, I think you're absolutely right, that there is something kind of anemic about that. It's missing the richness of the game.
I like the physical metaphors though, that it's an anemic. You're nodding vigorously, Simon, as we've been talking about esport. Are you a FIFA 2018?
No, but I think philosophically, we're in the domain of fantasy when it comes to football. Fantasy in the thick, proper, with a PH, fantasy sense, where real and unreal mix and blur. Watching live football is virtual, right? And particularly when you watch games in the evening, and you're in a stadium, Emirates or wherever it might be, and you're watching, you're there, actually there, but what you're watching resembles a virtual mediation. So football is play presenting itself. It's not explained through the thoughts of the players. It's not explained through data. It's what presents itself, and it presents itself in the form of total mediation. Completely Hegelian thesis in that sense, that there is something about that you could say there's a kind of, if you want to go there, I wouldn't be.
Yeah,
but
we could go Hegel. I kind of want to go Heidegger a little bit, because brace yourselves. This is the time to go for your half-time oranges if you're not interested.
Right, slip off.
But,
slip off for a half-time break.
Well, just because Emily was talking about flow, and you were talking about fantasy, and when I think about football, I have a very strange relationship to time when I watch football, right? I mean, that's partly to do with replays or the kinds of ways in which our experience at a match is fractured between looking at the game and then looking at, you know, your friend or going for a burger or whatever it is, right? You have a strange experience of time, and in really intense games, you know, the last few seconds can feel like years, and time telescopes. Time sometimes comes at you too fast. And kids often say, don't they, you know, I'm late home for dinner because I lost track of time. I was playing football with my mates. Yeah. So there seems to be something very peculiar temporally philosophically.
Yeah, it's a point. I mean, you know, Bergson, Heidegger. You know, the last 100-odd years, philosophers have been trying to make a point about that the time of the clock is not the fundamental lived experience of time. The lived experience of time is something which accelerates, decelerates. It can be have a duration. It can speed up. It can slow down. That we see that temporality in football. You see it happen. You see time compress, expand, and you see time compress and expand spatially. It's absolutely fascinating. So, I mean, one thing interests me just because the fact that Jurgen Klopp was born and brought up not far from where Heidegger was born. So on the basis of that happenstance, when Klopp talks about the moment, and he uses that word over and over again, I try and understand that in terms of what Heidegger says about ecstatic temporality. And ecstatic temporality is when you rise out of the inauthentic drift of time into a moment, right? And football, you can see that. You can see time like that at a certain point, and then so you know a lot of the points that philosophers from the traditions that interest me most were trying to make are perfectly evident when you watch a football game, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
There's a Stiglerian point here too. Stigler would begin by saying that actually all time is related to the experience of technology. The past comes into existence when one buys into a past through the adoption of an iPhone. I don't have to have lived through 200,000 years of knowledge making myself in order to use an iPhone. I am the inheritor of the entirety of human culture. And in putting on a football strip, playing with a ball, I am buying into a history that long precedes me, and playing with the ball, I am projecting a future in front of me. So
that's ecstatic temporality.
Ecstatic temporality, and this certainly comes into it too. I think another really interesting Stiglerian idea that comes into it too is that life is intermittent. You know, we become human only in these moments of disautomation, when we break out of habits and bifurcate, head off in one direction rather than another. And we get this with football. Nothing happens for ages, but then cryptobiotically, like the tardigrade that sleeps for thousands of years and then wakes up and eats something, nothing happens, and then everything springs into life very quickly and then closes down again.
It's usually Gareth Bale, isn't it?
I think we get this too.
Yeah, the man with the top knot.
Yeah, Heidegger's very inconsistent on this point. I can't remember if it's in your book, but I discovered the other week that Heidegger was a big Bayern Munich fan and had a secret TV in his office where he watched all the games.
Don't we all?
He liked Beckenbauer as well.
I was going to say, one of my favourite phrases associated with good sport is from an American philosopher called Warren Fraley, and he talks about good sport being the sweet tension of uncertainty of outcome. And I think that is absolutely
Yeah.
spot on in relation to football, because you know, you're right. The fact that the tension, because it's a bounded game by time, so the tension mounts and mounts, and one of the other beautiful things about football is it's quite low scoring. So there's always a chance that another team, the team can come back. You know, because two goals could be scored in the last, you know, couple of minutes. So if most games are, you know, the maximum of 3 or 4 goals between them, then there's always a chance, and that time element, the tension rises and rises, because you just don't know who is going to win. It could be either team, it could be...
Maybe there's more to it than that too, because I think quite often there is certainty of outcome. One can watch a Real Madrid game and however badly they're playing,
There's never
you know that they'll
certainty.
cheat their way
You
off.
don't know what's going to happen.
But you know, if you are the fan of a terrible team, it becomes less about whether you're going to win or not. You're resigned to the fact that you're not going to win, and more about how your team conducts itself in the face of certain
But
defeats.
isn't that why people love the FA Cup? Because
People don't love the FA Cup. We're bored out of our minds of it, and it should have been scrapped 15 years ago. Terrible competition. But
I don't know, on a muddy, you know, Liverpool, what was it, Yeovil on a slopey pitch, January with
keep it
a
as
muddy...
a memory for when it was good. Don't drag it out any further.
Can I ask you about... Oh, sorry, something.
Yeah, go on.
Well,
No.
I was going to ask you, just to move you slightly along before we head over to our own... This is going to be such a good segue, our own crowd.
Yeah.
I want to ask about... We've been talking about the ecstatic temporality, and I want to ask about the ecstasy of crowds, which we've touched on a little bit. But just that philosophy, one of the things that philosophers have done, if you want to think about philosophy of football, is theorise crowds, the way that groups work or collective action works.
Uh-huh.
And I think you say in your book, Simon, and I would agree with you, that it's too banal to imagine the crowd as a kind of Dionysiac spirit, a Dionysian spirit, right?
Yeah.
That seems too obvious. But there is that experience, lots of us who watch football at home or in the stadium, where you are ecstatic, you are beside yourself,
Yeah.
you are outside of yourself.
Yeah.
So do we need a new philosophy of the crowd? Could football furnish that?
Yeah. Yeah, well, we could have, yeah. I think it's about, a lot of football for many people here, many of us, is about childhood and about play and about what it was to lose yourself in a group or to be humiliated by a group, whatever it was by a group. Terrible things happened in playgrounds. I was looking at a playground last week. I was away somewhere at an Airbnb, looking over a German playground, watching kids. It's an amazing thing to watch a playground. And, you know, when you're in a huddle as kids, or there's a crowd, or maybe someone's being punched or something like that. Horrible thing. What comes the violence thing. Football is a violent game. It's about a symbolisation of that violence. It's about the ritualisation of violence, but it's violent. It's also about what happens to human beings in a crowd, which is intoxicating and terrifying. And we kind of forget that. Here we are with our little separated individual selves, with our thoughts and our phones and all that shit. When you're lost in a crowd, there's an ecstasy there which can go in all sorts of different ways, and that can't be regulated. And that's kind of one of the interesting, scary things about nice, scary things about football.
This plays out in very interesting and frustrating ways. That comes back to a point that you were making about the purity of the game and sportsmanship. And I think we want to be so careful about how far we go in the direction of trying to sanitise this. It's quite often forgotten that the roots of sport, we tend to think that they're so great and noble. Sport begins when the Greek aristocracy gets driven out of politics and turns to private drinking clubs, bacchanalia, and sport as a way of keeping them out of politics. And so it has always been linked to depoliticisation. And to want to purify everything that goes on the pitch so that we're no longer allowed to scream and get angry when... Or foul somebody deliberately, or take one for the team. I think you were kind of hinting at might happen in the pure world of esports. I don't like the direction that this is going in, and it's something that really strikes me. Coming back to Simon's point about the behaviour of the crowds here, is that politically there's a very interesting comparison between the way that we are still deeply uncomfortable. You know, the dominant trend is that when poor people are poor, we're more than happy to blame it on themselves, on them, and it's nothing to do with social causality. And yet when Gigi Buffon screams at an idiot referee, suddenly he is solely and uniquely responsible for everybody getting angry and sending the referee's wife death threats. And so you have a perverse inconsistency in our attribution of causality here, where the crowd suddenly get absolved of this behaviour and it all falls on the footballer as role model. I find this a really dubious inconsistency that's worth developing. And I think that comes back to what you were saying, Simon, about the terror that these crowds still instill, is that somehow, you know, the working classes amassed in one place are not in control of themselves, implicit assumption. They never were, and we're always treading on the very thin crust of civilization here.
And philosophy's crowd control.
In what way?
Since Plato's Republic, it's always been about crowd control, which is why the dominant tradition of philosophy is deeply anti-democratic. The problem is the problem of the crowd, the problem of the people as the crowd, and how do you form them? Plato had very clear ideas about that.
Let's turn to our own unruly crowd on that note. So I told you this segue was going to be good. Are there questions? Because we're going to have a roving mic. So there's one right at the back. Amazing. Let's get that one in first. We've got lots of time for questions, so take the time to formulate them.
Great.
You can ask for your for our pundits.
Pundits.
Our pundits.
That's right.
World Cup tips as well, if you're looking for some betting advice.
Okay. My name's Susan. I'm a lapsed Arsenal fan. Big fan of Sergio Ramos. Danny Kelly said recently that he's the third best player in the world after Cristiano Ronaldo and Messi. So he's a really, really good player.
No, I don't. See, here's an example of rationality.
What happened in the final.
Here's an example of rationality. I completely agree with you. He's a very good player.
Aside from that, it's very interesting. And I just wanted to touch on the issue of the kind of social dimension of football in relation to sexuality, and why it is in the men's game there's nobody out and proud gay. I mean, there seem to be a lot of women who are out in the game. Some of them, I think, in Arsenal lanes were even married to each other. But why not in men's football? And when is it going to happen?
Yeah, great question.
I thought this is. I mean, I live in New York, and football in that city is a different phenomenon. It's a participant sport. It's a spectator. People watch a lot of games, know a lot of what's going on. There's also this big, obviously Latin American connection. But in that regard, I feel kind of hopeful about the future of football in relationship to questions of gender. If you look at somewhere like the way football, it's a middle class participant sport, and the US national team has won the World Cup 3 times. So to that extent, there's and a lot of say if I go down the road to my local park, most of the games will be mixed gender, transgender, the whole thing, and there's a different vision of the game from other places. So I think I don't know whether that's going to happen or not, but I'm kind of quite hopeful that things are something seems to have shifted, I think, in terms of the, not just, what's the right word, into the coverage of football. I'm sort of, I think that maybe another 20, 30 years we might be asking a different set of questions. And if Cristiano comes out, then...
I was going to say the one thing that was going to make me stop disliking Cristiano Ronaldo intensely was when he came out, but sadly it looks like he's married with lots of children, and that's no longer on the cards.
I think it's advised in those situations to preface comment with allegedly, right? Just so that we avoid any...
Allegedly, there was a time he flew on a private jet to hang out with a Moroccan kickboxer every day, but allegedly now he's happily married with several children. But I wonder how much there's a kind of bizarre thinness to this particular phenomenon. I'll explain what I mean by that. I think there's a lot of performance that goes alongside football, and performance of a particularly silly, pretentious nature. When, for example, Zidane gets sent off for headbutting Marco Materazzi, and a great many people come out and say, well, isn't this outrageous and despicable? And they're thinking, they don't actually believe that. They think it's quite funny. There's a lot of just pretend morality. Isn't this a really bad thing? And then even people who'll come out and defend it will say, oh, it was legitimate in this circumstance because he was rude about Zidane's mother. And nobody really cares if he was rude about Zidane's mother or not. It's rubbish. It was just funny and we enjoyed it. But people won't come out and say that. And I wonder how much of the same silly performance of feigned morality is at the heart of a lot of the issues around homosexuality in football. Which is to say, there's an excellent but idiotic Belgian footballer, Rajan Nainggolan, plays for AS Roma, who was in the news this week for talking about how much he cheats on his wife and how much he would hate a homosexual footballer. And you think, I don't think he really would for a minute. Yeah. I'm sure if he found out that someone in his dressing room was gay, he'd be fine with it after 30 seconds of feeling vaguely perturbed that he hadn't worked it out for himself. And so I wonder, how much are we building this up to be a big thing, that it really would be some phenomenal event? And from my understanding, there are quite a lot of openly gay footballers who are open to their teammates. The thing that they dread is not the reaction of their teammates, it's the tabloid press going on about it and using it as an excuse to do all sorts of privacy-invading stories. So I suspect that we've made being gay in football far bigger thing than it really is, and all it would take is a tiny little puncturing to make it. So I'm quite hopeful in the way that you are there, Simon.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with the last few things you said, in the sense that once it becomes normal, it's not going to be an issue. I think one of the concerns from footballers is the reaction of the crowd, and the fact that if one player comes out, that actually it's going to be really, really difficult for them. They'll set a precedent, and it will be easier for everybody that comes out after that. But it takes a really brave person in that culture to be able to step forward and come out as gay. I think in relation to the women's game, it's a very, very different culture, and historically has been very different, because sport is associated with all these masculine qualities. Therefore, women that play sport have traditionally already been labelled as abnormal because they're interested in sport, and I think therefore it's the history of the women's game has been very, very different. The profile is obviously a lot lower, and for most women's teams, it's normal to have players that are gay. It's accepted, it's normal, and nobody, it doesn't go against the masculine kind of culture, that expectation. Whereas I think with the men's game, it's a very different history, very different culture.
Do you have a sense of there being more women in the game, in the crowd, playing football generally? Has that culture changed and become more amenable to that?
Sorry. So
do you think there are more women generally, just in your experience of more women playing, more women in the crowd?
Definitely.
More women
Absolutely. I think, again, the culture of football has changed, so it is more accepted for women to play. It's now televised. There's obviously the Women's Super League is growing in terms of its spectator numbers and its profile, and the women's big competitions, European and World Cup, again, it's growing in profile. So it's much more accepted, and I think women's sport is on a upward trajectory, because it's been totally kind of neglected in the past. And even when I grew up, and I remember when I was at school in the 80s, and I asked, can we have a women's football team, and I got told, oh no, because of like health and safety. And I'm thinking, well, hang on a minute, what? Seriously, I'm thinking, why are the boys like, surely actually hockey is much more dangerous, so so I think that culturally is definitely changed in terms of the women's game, and the skill level is getting better. The difficulty is that the women's game is at least 50 years behind the men. They haven't had the professionalisation in terms of the time that they've been able to dedicate in terms of growing up playing the game, but also having that additional coaching and training. And actually, I think the women's game is surprisingly good, considering the where it's come from and the development and the input it has. So I would say that I've watched more women's games in the last few years than I have men's, generally.
We should all do that. There's a great book by Anna Kessel, who is a football writer, called Eat, Sweat, Play, which is about getting women into sports, particularly football. I really recommend that. Let's get another question. There was one right in the middle there. Let's get that one. I'm just enjoying your questions so much. I'm letting you each ask your question rather than take a bundle. But I'll try and squeeze you all in.
Hi. Question for Simon. I think it's in the book that you talk about Klopp as a Christian believer and how this has projected the belief of the team. How do you think he can or has or is using this narrative to rebuild confidence post-Kiev, both for the team and his goalkeeper?
That's a good question. I haven't got the faintest idea. It's a good question. I mean, Klopp's interesting because he's not terribly vocal about his religious faith, but it's there, and when he's asked, he answers. And this clearly informs his behaviour with other people, as he sees it, as other people see it. Sympathetic. He likes to help people. All of that stuff, and there's something higher, there's something more than the game. So I don't know. I mean, I think Karius is, 10 years of psychoanalysis with a good Freudian analyst, and the best drugs money can buy this summer, and then hopefully he gets through. But I mean, it's hard to. I mean, I think it was interesting at the end of the Champions League final when he was, prostrate on the floor, and then it was the Real Madrid players who first came to him to console him, and also this thing about crying as well. We had him crying, we had Carvajal crying, we had Mo Salah crying. The phenomenon of crying, and then there was a Paul Scholes thing I was reading today about Scholesy was a little bit dismissive of all these tears, but I think he's. I think Klopp is good at building teams from elements that aren't really that promising. I mean, if you look at that Liverpool team, it's not a great team in many ways, with a 19-year-old fullback and James Milner rejected by Manchester City and so on and so forth. There's some stars, but there's no depth. And I think the problem with Klopp is getting the people that own the club to actually pay some money, some net spend, so things get better. But also, there's I guess the problem with the Klopp approach is this emphasis on the moment and being together and the team, and this explosive football that's with the fans has the capacity to just explode. So the strange thing about Liverpool, watching Liverpool the whole season, every game as I have, it's these extraordinarily beautiful sequences of play will happen 10, 20 minutes, and then we will collapse and we'll go into this kind of febrile, anxious, lack of self-belief. And it's if you're building a team, you've got to build something stronger than that. That wouldn't happen with Juventus, for good reasons.
Did against Real Madrid.
Well, yeah, but that was that.
But yeah. I think where the religion with Klopp does come into it, I think this idea of the moment is about communion. I'd be very surprised if that really comes across in the way that he speaks to players. One of the things that was very interesting about Arsene Wenger, as it was said at the end of his time, that he had completely lost the ability to talk to the younger generation of players. He just didn't know how to relate to them. Yeah. And I'd have thought that one of the things that would make somebody like Klopp extremely good at managing is that he does know how to relate to them, and I suspect that probably means, in the majority, but maybe not all cases, that he doesn't bring religion into it. He knows the wavelength through which to engage specific players, and the language in which
apart
to
from
do
Bobby
that.
Firmino, who's got, have faith in God in ancient Greek on his
There are
chest.
still quite a lot of players who are, quite a surprising number of players who are very religious.
Mo Salah, right?
Mo Salah too.
Mo Salah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
I think that's a question about
We're building a theocracy at Liverpool.
Good luck. Let's take another question before I start sounding a bit more about Liverpool. There's a question here.
Yeah, thanks. So this is to do with esports, and one of the attractions being that there's no version for game pushing things. I was wondering if maybe another attraction is that there's no refereeing mistakes. And with that in mind, what are your thoughts on VAR?
That is an excellent point, and I agree with you in the sense that there are the game is the game. There is not a referee in the sense of who's fallible and who may make mistakes. In relation to the kind of the technological question, do we want a perfect game whereby there is no human fallibility, is no human error?
Right.
Or is that something that we ought to value? Now, I would say that probably most fans would say that we don't want human error. We want the referee to always get it right every single time. But then, are we diminishing the game in some respect? As I said, I'm a purist, so I would say that you want a pure game. I don't know what the partisans would say in relation to this.
I mean, as we're in a philosophical concept, I mean, you know, at one level we want to be Kantians. We want regulations. We want imperatives that are going to be applied consistently in relationship to examples. On the other hand, being a football fan is more Wittgensteinian. You know, it's about examples and exceptions. And so what Ramos did with Mo Salah was not illegal, right? It could have been sent off for that if it had been interpreted a different way. But the importance of cheating in football is really, really key, right? It's part of the joy of the game. It's not just fallibility, but the players that can bend the rules, like Giorgio Chiellini or Luis Suarez. So we like there to be rules, and we like to see those rules being bent.
How do you see your advantage?
No, but in the case of Ramos, you think, it was physical assault on Mohamed Salah, our greatest player. But on the other hand, it's very good defensive play. You reckon this is you take the best player out of the game, and that's the way he did it. And another level, I think I applaud that, and he got away with it great. So I think the importance of cheating is kind of interesting.
The other thing to say here is that a Turingian point after Alan Turing, it's not true that referees in esports are infallible. They have a different kind of fallibility. Going back to Turing's point that machine mistakes are not the same as human mistakes. There have long been glitches in AI in FIFA that people can exploit. The current version of FIFA does not know that it's not handball if it bounces onto the hand off another part of the body, for example. So there are always little glitches that creep in, and the computer remains fallible in the same way that referees are, albeit structurally slightly different ways. But I think we want to preserve that space of fallibility anyway, and we've seen that this is the case. VAR's been used in Italy for the last year, and it's changed the way that interpretations happen, but it hasn't eliminated the role of interpretation. This has become a persistent feature, is that you now have these 5-minute pauses in a game where people stand around and reach the same conclusion that they would have done anyway, and it's by no means, and I think this ends up being an interesting philosophical point, a Stiglerian point. Stigler would say here that the cure is always also the poison. So it cures one thing, but then it becomes toxic in another respect. And we've seen this with VAR. It solves some problems, but it just, the way that it works forces you to realise that there is an ineliminable element of interpretation in any, be it the way that the PlayStation is coded to understand the movement of the ball, or the way that the referee is coded to understand the transgression of the rule as seen through a slowed-down video replay.
Yeah. I'll just make 2 points in relation to that. So, on YouTube, there's loads of clips about all these glitches in FIFA. So, and most of them are quite funny, and like really odd things happening, which are obviously related to the programming. And the other point I was going to make is that I remember many years ago, before the implementation of goal line technology, and Sepp Blatter he came up with 7 reasons why it shouldn't be implemented, and one of them was that goal line technology should not be introduced because it will stop the fans talking about these controversial decisions in the pub afterwards, and that's one of the joys of the game, is the discussion about, well, should it have been a goal, was it a foul, was it not a foul?
Yelling truth to power.
Yeah, so and I suppose there's something in that, is that, you know, it is those moments of controversy remain kind of indelibly in the memory about, you know, we were robbed because the referee got it wrong in that case. And I think you're absolutely right in relation to, there will always be it will always be a matter of interpretation, and you can see that in rugby, where they've had the video technology for a long time, and they've got all these different angles of whether a ball was touched down or not, and they can look at all the different camera angles, and still they don't know. Still they're not quite sure about whether it really was grounded or whether it wasn't grounded, and it's still up to somebody to make that judgment and to interpret what they're seeing.
Debates in Italy end up being no longer a case of, well, was it a foul in the box, so much was, well, at what point did this particular phase of play originate, and therefore did the foul halfway down the pitch really form part of the same phase of play that ended up in the scoring of the goal. So it shifts the attention to elsewhere on the pitch, but not conclusively by any means.
Let's get more questions. There's lots now. Great. There's one in the middle here. Can we get the mic to the third row there? Let's get that one in.
Some at the back as well, man.
Yeah, we'll try and get them in. I get one full question, and then I get three in a row, so I can get all of them.
The recent trend in football has been for managing players to move around far more than they used to. Like with Wenger leaving recently, people say that's never going to happen again for a manager to stay a post that long. Picking up on the socialist aspect of football, do you think that this constant movement will sort of increase that collective spirit because it becomes more about the team and the club and its history, and not so much any one individual? Or do you think it will sort of hollow out teams so that it becomes an empty brand?
I don't know. It's a good question. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that question. But the sort of merry-go-round of managerial sackings is, it's, you know, we won't see another Wenger for a good long time. But for me, it's, you know, the fans of the continuity, the fans of the archive, the fans of the repository of the meaning and value of the team. Players and coaches come and go, but I mean, the point that people, I mean, you know, it's you're going to lose, right? Teams, so, you know, it's about, this is a game that is essentially, this is a game that's about losing. There are 20 teams in the Premier League, 19 of them are going to lose. So it's more likely, so what does that do, and how does one deal with that? I was in Denmark recently and was shown this footage about the Brøndby fans. Brøndby failed to win the Danish Super League, having, you know, imploded the last couple of games, and the Brøndby fans were clapping their players. There was this kind of ritual act of, and there's something about the, for me, I mean, despite everything and everything that was said, and I agree with it about what's been happening in football, the addictive quality of it. There's something about, in football, there's a capacity for decency, self-respect, dignity in relationship to a team and being a fan, despite everything, and with everything, with all the kind of crap that's going on. And that is that's not insignificant to me. It's really it's a really important thing.
That's a really good half-time talk.
Two points there. One, I think many of us will have had one-night stands or 3-week flings that leave a more indelible mark on the mind than marriages. And I think the same can be true of relationships with players. They don't need to be there for 15 years to really work their way into your heart and change the way that you experience the game. The second point, and it feels like a bizarre point to be making, but coming back to something I said earlier about the proletarianisation of the footballer too, and we see this, you know, what does it tell us about the dominant economic model of the precariat and the precariousness of employment, that we see this happening to footballers too. And one of the effects of social media has been that we become far more aware of the players who gently get let go at the end of the contract, who maybe getting paid vast amounts of money relative to what we're on, but they have very precarious existences, and we wouldn't envy the people who move from Malta to Malaysia to Iceland, you know, constantly in search of that little contract that enables them to keep going with that vocation for just a bit longer. So I think that too, we've started to see a much more humanising side of the game come to the fore, where we relate to players in a different way, and the economic difficulties that they go through actually means that you can relate to somebody for that too. You know, people were talking...
All the abuse stories that come out.
Yeah, not just the abuse stories. The West Ham chap that was let go over email a couple of weeks ago, and people get very indignant about that. I'm sure he's a millionaire multiple times over. But we feel violated vicariously by these breaches of dignity. And I think that counts.
Yeah.
Let's squeeze in a few more questions. So one here, and there was another one there. Can we get that one there? And then one more, and the one just...
a couple at the back there.
Is there someone at the back? And the back there, thank you. So here first, there, and then thank you. We'll take 3 in a row.
Okay. I'm Anna Balboa, and I have one leadership observation, what fascinates me.
Leadership.
Leadership. What I like to get your comments about. For these coaches, they must do their work before and after. They are not allowed to go and involve in the game, on the playground. And in business leaders, in companies, they are fully allowed to go and get involved with the operational issues. Take part in negotiations, have opinions about the detail, how to design something. And this has fascinated me, so that you're forced to do your work before and after. You are not able to go and help them.
Great.
Please, can I get some comments?
No, you put that very well. I think it's, yeah.
I'm going to get 3 in a row.
Put that very well.
So I can squeeze a few more. It is a very interesting question. So there's a mic over here. Perfect.
Simon, you talked about how democratic football is and helps their opinion.
Socialism. Yeah, not democracy.
Socialists, yeah.
I was just wondering what the role of expertise in football is.
Expertise.
So I'm always struck by kind of how little I know when I read tactical analyses or statistical analyses, and there is now, it seems, much more sophisticated analysis of football going on than perhaps there was 30 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps a greater distance, I think, if you compare what Guardiola does compared to what Keating did 20 years ago,
mm-hmm.
there's perhaps a greater distance between the fans saying this behind the
Great. And then
Yeah.
one more question.
Oh, you're bundling.
I'm
Okay.
getting 3 in a row just so we can squeeze
Okay.
this in.
Well, I have anyway 2 questions. One is regarding the comment you all made on how tiring we're getting of over-consuming football. And the question is about the 2026 World Cup, where we're going to have 48 teams. How do you think that will affect our over-consuming of football, considering that FIFA wants to get to new markets, and that's the reason why they're incorporating new countries? And the second thing is about, you mentioned the statistics version that spoke before me. I've read a lot on how we are looking for efficiency into sports through the statistical analysis and the over-analysis of the performance of players and how we're using technology to improve that performance. Do you think that is affecting also the creativity of players, and that's just another, and how that relates with the industrialization of new sports?
Okay, great. So what about leadership? What about socialism and expertise? Overconsumption of football, and one about how efficiency is affecting creativity.
Can I jump in on the leadership question first? Because I don't think it's true. You look at someone like Zinedine Zidane, what has marked him out as a manager is his ability to make decisive substitutions. Now, he only gets to do that 3 times in a match, but the same can be said of a CEO for any large corporation You cannot be backseat driving your team the whole time. You cannot stand behind them and shout them orders. If you do that, they'll stop listening after the first 10 minutes. So actually the skills that Zidane shows on the sideline of biding one's time and intervening decisively at punctuated moments, I think this is also something that you'd see in any large company as well. But it's true that, of course, you get preparation before and after, but not uniquely so.
Yeah, picking up on particularly the question, well, probably all the questions. One of my concern about elite sport more generally is this technologicalisation of the athlete and trying to quantify absolutely everything. So there'll be a whole range of backroom staff that are looking at the work rate of athletes in terms of their GPS, how much they've run compared to their fitness profile, and therefore managers will be told, well, hang on a minute, this player is actually, they've peaked, they're just going to go downhill, take them off now. And so you will see that more and more, this notion of, well, it's just about the kind of quantification of the athlete and the body as machine that needs to be fixed and repaired. And that's one of my concerns about elite sport, is that it's becoming much more about quantifying performance rather than the ability to show flair, creativity, and actually there may be moments of brilliance that, you know, you look on a particular algorithm that says, no, this player will start to deteriorate now, but they'll manage to kind of pull it around and do something incredible. And we won't see that so much, I think, in the future, because it will all be run, unless you've got a good manager, arguably, which is able to kind of say, actually, no, you know, I'm going to dismiss this sports scientist next to me telling me what's going on. I can see that they're actually still playing really well and they've got something extra to give. So that's my concern in terms of the way that sport is being commodified.
It's almost like the irrational or the non-reasonable, the thing that shouldn't, the philosophy was trying to exclude.
Well, you still get Moneyball done well, can still get you Pascal Gross and N'Golo Kante. There are ways of using it effectively that don't simply involve a race to the bottom in terms of maximum efficiency. And, you know, they used to say of Patrick Vieira, will only play till 25 because one leg's shorter than the other. And, you know, done on a purely quantifying basis, you end up shooting yourself in the feet very quickly. And I think that people will ultimately be intelligent enough to make that decision within the game for themselves. But of course, I think that this over-quantification, and especially with regard to management of overstressed bodies and expectation that players play on regardless, is pretty pernicious and undesirable.
So, did you want to have a go at one of the questions?
Very good questions. I can't answer them fully, but one thing I'd say is that again, as we're in a philosophical context, football suffers from the era of subjectivism, the idea that somehow the contents of our minds explain our actions, right? So a player will be asked after a game, what was going through your mind when you scored that goal? And as you play the game, nothing is going through your mind. Play is not in the head. Play is on the surface of play. You're out there. So the era of subjectivism, and then the bigger era is the era of objectivism, the idea that football is explained through objective data, and the rise of tactical analysis is very interesting. I think in the last 20 years, has the internet been good or bad for human beings? Question mark. I don't know, but for football, I think it's been pretty good. And the rise of kind of football journalism has been remarkable. But the objectivism is another delusion. Football's not explained through statistical data. It takes place in the Middle Kingdom. It takes place in the area between selves and objects explained scientifically. That's where the phenomenon of play happens. And the good leader, the good manager is able to make that judgment, to see that from a certain distance and to make the right judgment. I was in Madrid when Zidane resigned, and it's a very interesting moment because they really had no idea. And a thing that interests me, a text that interested me a lot about 10 years ago was this text by Jean-Philippe Toussaint called The Melancholy of Zidane. and Zidane's melancholy. And there is something about this moment last Thursday when he resigned, which is like the moment when he was sent off after headbutting Materazzi. And there's a kind of melancholic quality to Zidane, which interests me. And I think it's not something that most managers have. You know, knowing when to stop, knowing when to pull away. So what Zidane kind of recognised in that moment is that this can't go on. This is it. I can't repeat this, and it should end. And that's both a recognition of a kind of mortality, right, and a melancholy. And there's something about, you know, maybe there are other players like this. Maybe Cantona, who we have not talked about, the great philosopher of football, Eric Cantona.
The question on all your lips about the sardines, but I'm not going to ask it. The last thing I'm going to ask is about the melancholy in England. What are our chances?
Is everybody? So lose to Belgium, right? Beat Panama, draw with Tunisia, second round, maybe get through, then lose to Portugal, Argentina on penalties.
Quite a decent batch of young players. I would be quite pleased to see them go out in the first round.
Oh, let's finish on an optimistic note in the sense that
Northern Ireland will be my team if I had one at international level.
Yeah, I disagree with you. There's always a chance, and that's the beauty of sport in the sense that you never can quite kind of say it's the end until it is the end.
It is the end. You've been a really beautiful panel for the beautiful game. Would you join me in thanking Simon Critchley, Gerald Moore, and everyone?